Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to begin. I would like to welcome you to this informal intersessional preparatory meeting on the priority theme of the 61st session of the Commission for Social Development. Dear colleagues, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in massive job and income losses. It has worsened inequalities and multiple forms of deprivation. Poverty increased, hunger, chronic, undernourished, and school dropped out all increased. It has immensely impacted the implementation of the 2030 agenda and has made achieving many of the SDGs even more challenging. In most countries, the worst impact of the pandemic are now receding. However, the overlapping economic, climate, and political crises are still posing a big challenge to many countries around the world. Labor market inequalities within and between countries persist. In terms of paid work, women are currently working about 15 hours per week, less than men. In middle and high-income countries, the number of hours worked has already reached pre-pandemic levels. By contrast, the majority of low-income and lower middle-income countries still have a 2 to 3% deficit in employment levels compared to pre-pandemic period. These inequalities contribute to a growing divergence between the developed and developing countries' economies, with the latter recovering more slowly from the COVID-19 pandemic. It is therefore fitting that the Commission choose the theme of, and I quote, creating full and productive employment and decent work for all as a way to overcome inequalities to accelerate the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I will now turn to the presentation for today's informal meeting, which is intended to advance preparations for the Commission's discussion of its priority theme. I am pleased, of course, to welcome to this meeting the Director of the International Labour Organization Office in New York, Ms. Piet Andreas, who will make a presentation. Before giving the floor to Ms. Andreas, I invite participants wishing to take the floor to complete for the form that has been posted on the chat board. Please ensure that the name of your delegation or accredited organization and your full name appear as part of the Zoom username in order to be given the floor. We will now, of course, turn to the presentation by the Director of International Labour Organization in New York. Ms. Andreas, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Dear delegates connected to this virtual meeting, UN colleagues and civil society, great to see you all. I will give a very short introduction and then would, of course, welcome your questions and comments. We also have two colleagues from our office here connected who can also provide additional information in the chat box, background resources or documents if you're interested. And I want to congratulate also all of you for choosing this very fitting topic. As Ambassador Altine, as you just said, it is really in this context of overlapping crises in a very important topic, which will hopefully offer some solutions, in particular for those often left behind and those left behind by the more recent crises. I'd like to first start with some overall labor market trends based on our recent statistics, and then go a little bit deeper into the issues of inequality and informality before then turning to some of the policy solutions that the ILO and ILO constituents have seen as particularly relevant in this context. So let me start with the overall trends. And unfortunately, I cannot paint a very optimistic or positive picture. We've seen, however, looking at labor market trends for a longer trajectory, that progress through decent work is possible. And I want to start with that positive message, just to say that we have seen over the last 30 years a remarkable shift of employment out of agriculture into the service industry in particular, an increase in the proportion of wage and salaried employees, and importantly, a decline in working poverty. And I just want to give you the numbers here. In 1995, 30% of men and women were in extreme working poverty. In 2019, just before the COVID pandemic hit, the number was down to 6.7%. That's a remarkable decline. However, the recent COVID pandemic and other crises are now reversing that positive trend. We have also seen at the turn of the century a remarkable steep increase of ratification of international labor standards. And this was, of course, spearheaded by globalization and economic integration through trade. However, decent work deficits have persisted, reflected in high unemployment rates, significant gender disparities, and that's between labor force participation rates and wages between women and men, as well as high rates of informality. And the financial crisis in 2008, as well as the most recent health crisis, have stalled that progress, and the world is now seriously off track in reaching SDG Goal 8 on decent work. On informality in particular, we've seen the share of informal workers has not decreased significantly in recent years. The latest ILO estimate is that 2 billion people are still working informally, and this represents 61% of global employment. And the informal economy is often, of course, linked to greater inequalities and working poverty. For youth, in particular, the situation was even more devastating, especially since the financial crisis. The global youth unemployment rate continued to rise after 2009. However, it has reached a peak of 13.8% in 2016. And we've seen in our recent estimates that young people were disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic. In the pre-crisis context, we have seen 4 million young people, a rise of 4 million young people in so-called not in employment or education. And this number rose by 1.5% in 2020. So focus again on gender here and on youth is particularly important. So what I also want to highlight that a key feature of the COVID-19 crisis was the divergence in recovery. We have seen in advanced economy a relatively quick return to higher employment rates, especially in the number of hours worked in 2021, whereas that trend was not observed in middle or lower income countries. And as I said, this is now compounded by the triple crisis of food insecurity, energy, and finance. So let me now turn to a few reflections on the link between decent work, inequality, and informality. And I would like to also encourage you to take a look at the recently adopted ILO resolutions on inequality and informality. We have seen that countries with higher levels of inequality and informality are generally less resilient in the events of external shocks and crises. And again, the COVID pandemic was a particular sad example of that thesis. We have, in recent research published by the IMF and the OECD, we also see that high levels of inequality tend to have a harmful effect on the pace and on the sustainability of economic growth, which means that greater equality is associated with longer and stronger periods of economic growth. I just want to say a quick word on the distinction between what we call vertical inequalities and horizontal inequalities. In other words, inequalities that are vertical are between richer and poorer people, and those that are horizontal are between different groups or categories in society. And that is important if we don't want to leave anyone behind. And what we've seen in the recent debate on inequality is that the focus was very much on vertical inequalities. And in many countries, the richest 1% or the top 10% of income earners have improved their situation compared to the poorest 99% or the bottom 90%. So that's the vertical inequality. But we've also now an emerging body of literature that focuses on horizontal inequalities within societies, especially with affecting populations that are discriminated against on the basis of their identity, their gender, color, or beliefs. Now, specifically on gender inequalities, they represent one of the greatest forms of inequality today. And here we have in particular an inequality in terms of participation of women in social and economic life. And this affects all countries, no matter their level of development. These forms of discrimination are often deeply rooted in society. We have recently measured that women spend on average 4 hours and 25 minutes per day performing unpaid care work, compared to 1 hour and 23 minutes performed by men on such work. So there's a steep difference here in terms of gender participation in care work. And of course, one of the policy solutions here is to invest in care work and make it economically viable and more interesting. Overall, high levels of income inequality slow down poverty reduction. We have seen, as I've mentioned earlier in the beginning, that in many developing countries, we've seen a significant reduction in poverty, of course, as I said, reversed, unfortunately, through the recent crises. However, millions of low-income households still remain unable to cover adequately the cost of their basic needs. And indeed, the SDG target 1.1 on poverty has to be seen really in conjunction with the SDG goal 10 on inequality. Inequality and poverty are often associated with environmental degradation. And we have seen this in specific economic sectors, like in the fishing industry or in forestry. And so that connection also has to be put into perspective here. And very briefly on informality, again, as I said earlier, we still have 2 billion people working in the informal sector. Often they are also part of the working poor. And the newly emerging platform economy is now also encouraging on formal employment and creating new precarious forms of employment in that sector. Now, let me turn to the third part and say a few words about possible policy remedies and solutions. And I want to focus in particular on the relevance of institutions and social policies. As I said earlier, we have seen since the turn of the century a remarkable increase in ratification of international labor standards, in particular of those related to fundamental principles and rights at work. We have this year, the ILO constituents have decided to include occupational safety and health in the body of fundamental principles and rights. And those conventions will hopefully also see a very quick increase in ratification. On some of those standards, like child and forced labor, we see almost universal recognition and implementation of those standards. Unfortunately, again, because of the crisis, we've seen recently an increase in child labor and forced labor, and that's very much related to working poverty. So the first point here is really that investing in labor standards, and they are part of the broader body of human rights, creates an enabling environment for enterprises to develop, but also for workers to be protected, and for the poorest and most disadvantaged to be integrated into the formal labor market. My second point here is to focus on wage policies. And of course, wage policies are also very much linked to collective bargaining, which is a fundamental right. According to the ILO's latest global wage report, we have seen that monthly wages fell in real terms to minus 0.9% in the first half of that year. And this is the first time this century that real global wage growth has been negative. So in other words, the global crises that we are facing have led to a decline in real wages. It has placed tens of millions of workers in a dire situation as they face increasing uncertainties. Among the advanced G20 countries, real wages in the first half of 2022 were estimated to decline to minus 2.2%. But of course, in emerging G20 countries, they grew only by 0.8%. We can share the latest report again in the chat if you're interested in the statistics, but the important message here is that the current crisis, the rising inflation, is biting into the purchasing power of wage workers, and in particular also those who depend on minimum wages. So there have to be quick policy responses here to allow nominal adjustments to take place, and to make sure that price inflation is not eroding the real value of wages, in particular of minimum wages that secure the income for so many people. The third point is to invest in social protection floors. Currently, 4 billion people are still without any social protection benefit. Now, the silver lining of the COVID pandemic was that we have seen more than 3,000 policy measures taken by governments to invest in social protection and to mitigate the shocks or absorb the shocks of the COVID pandemic. Even this year, in response to the cost of living crisis, we have seen hundreds of new measures taken by governments that can help, in particular, the poorest to weather the crisis. It is now essential that these often short-term measures are turned into long-term sustainable, what we call social protection floors. And for that to happen, countries need the necessary fiscal space, but of course also strong institutions and technical support to implement those policies. The fourth point I'd like to mention is the importance of investing in skills and in education. Here again, the ILO this year has adopted a resolution on skills and lifelong learning. And this resolution lays out some pathways of what governments can do to support skills and training systems, and vocational training systems in particular. And finally, just a few reflections on the importance to support what we call just transitions as countries move towards greener, more digital economies, and as we have to respond to the demographic challenges. In other words, rising youth population, but also aging in many countries. We have seen that through our statistics that investments, in particular in the care and in the green economy, can create at least 400 million jobs. And many more jobs can be created in the digital economy. They create opportunities for youth, for women, but it is important that those jobs are decent. So therefore, our call for strong institutions and the protection of rights. I also want to mention two important policy initiatives that are relevant in this discussion. First, the Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transitions, which was launched by the UN Secretary General in 2021, and which now has brought the UN system together with a coherent strategy that will help countries that request that help to implement just transition plans and policies, integrating social protection and employment policies in a more strategic manner, and mobilizing the necessary financing tools to do so. And another more recent initiative has been actually just discussed this morning in the United Nations headquarters, is a renewed focus on what's called the social and solidarity economy. In other words, a focus on alternative models of economic growth that focus on people and on the planet. There is a potential for more job creation in the social and solidarity economy that currently employs more than 100 million people, and greater recognition of that form of enterprise and social activity would go a long way in supporting, in particular, those often left behind. Madam Chair, I will stop here, and we are available, of course, for questions, comments, and I hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Beatrice, for a very informative presentation. I thank you again for that. I would like now to open the floor for comments and questions, and I wish to remind participants to inscribe through the online speaker request form that is posted on the chat board of the platform. And I actually recognize two requests. I would like now to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union. Please, you have the floor.
I think we need to do something with the camera because you cannot see us. I think you can see us now, probably. So, okay. I just wanted, first of all, to thank the chair, Mrs. Alia Ahmed Saif Al-Thani, the members of the Bureau, very important, and we thank them, the Secretariat, and of course, Ms. Beate Andres, for your presentation, which highlighted exactly the priority theme. My name is Tizvi Ekmedzoglu. I'm from the EU delegation, and I have the pleasure to be here in the EU delegation with a lot of member states around this table, EU member states, and I deliver this intervention on behalf of all the EU member states. I think that it goes without saying that we express the constructive engagement of the EU and the member states in the preparatory work and the upcoming deliberations of the CSocD61 session. And we are really going to work jointly towards a useful outcome of this session. As you all know, the EU is committed sharing the global agenda on decent work and promoting, as you correctly said, a human-centered future to work to champion human rights, including the well-being of all workers, both at home and abroad. So the EU aspires to champion the decent work, not only at the EU member states and inside the EU, but also globally, and in line with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan that will further our actions. Just a quick reference to what we are doing at the moment. There are a lot, but we just renew our focus on decent work this year in February. when the European Commission has adopted the communication on decent work worldwide. So we have now policies that will reach out the global the world outside and not be introvert but extrovert. This communication sends exactly a strong signal about the EU's intention to strengthen its role as responsible leader on promoting decent work. It pursues the 4 mutual reinforcing objectives of promoting employment standards and right at work, social protection, and social dialogue. You referred already to some of those. Gender equality and non-discrimination are cross-cutting issues in relation to these 4 objectives. And this communication sets out also how the European Union will act upon the challenges linked to a just green and digital transition and a sustainable recovery from the pandemic. So we are really heard what you said, and we are really, I think we have responses. The EU is fostering its effort to tackle forced labor and further support our zero tolerance policy on child labor. In September, we published a proposal for a regulation prohibiting products made with forced labor on the union market. This is a critical step towards the Commission's commitment to promote decent work. And further, as we are responsible global player, hello? Yeah, supporting the universal values of human rights and a major economic power, the EU takes a strong stance on upholding and updating the multilateral rules-based global order, including international labor standards. Creating full and productive employment and decent work for all is essential, as we need to accelerate our efforts to recover and build back from COVID-19 and the related impacts for sustainable development. We are therefore looking forward to the deliberations ahead of us, and we will follow the process closely. In view of our preparations, we have some questions, one of which is related to the theme, but we have also some other logistic questions that we understand it's not the purpose of this session. However, I'm going to point 1 or 2 issues that are also important. The first question is, considering the relevance of employment in the framework of the global discussions on business and human rights, which role will the UN guiding principles and related actions for implementation by UN member states play during this year's session? The second question is related to the linkages of the high-level political forum and SDGs. We understand that there is a linkage with the high-level political forum. Could you please elaborate how you see the outcome of the resolutions, and in particular the priority theme as we discuss it today, reflected in the high-level political forum, and how the Bureau plans to facilitate those links? Also, how do you see the outcome of the resolution being reflected in the 2023 SDG Summit that will take place in September and will mark the midpoint of the implementation of the 2030 agenda? And finally, you mentioned about youth and women. I just wonder, and we wonder here around the table, how you are going to embed the youth program into the work of the session. The EU member states youth representatives are present each year and eager to engage more on economic and social rights issues. So what are the plans? And maybe it's not this session to mention, but for us it's important to know what also DESA has the intention to do to create the program for them. Thank you very much.
Very well. I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. I now would like to give the floor to Ms. Jean Quinn, the chair of the NGO Committee on Social Development. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and it's good to see you again after a few days. Also, Beauty, it's wonderful to see you as well. And we were very grateful for your support with NGO CSocD when you came to us as a speaker. For us as a committee, creating full and productive employment and decent work for all, including people who are the hardest hit to reach, requires the voice, power and representation of all. Meaningful participation of people with direct experience of extreme poverty and seeking employment is key to developing effectively policies, programs, projects to overcome social inclusion. Active engagement and inclusive dialogue will help ensure the best possible and longest lasting outcomes are achieved, including the voice and knowledge of people living the daily realities of extreme poverty, lack of employment and decent work. In conversations will provide governments and the UN agencies and civil society with relevant perspectives needed for policy decisions and implementation. Also, the process towards a new social summit could provide the platform to gain perspective, balance, and renew momentum, forging a renewed vision and commitment to achieve a higher quality of life for all people. Elaborating a gender transformative new social contract rooted in SDG 8 and supporting the vision of the UN General Secretary's report, Our Common Agenda, and the UN Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protections, with full implementation of universal social protection, are immediate tools at hand to address both the value pillar and an action pillar. And I suppose our questions in relation to that are going back to the UN Secretary General's report, how can the outcome of CSocD best advance his report in his call to action and priorities outlined in our common agenda? And secondly, and really importantly for us as members of NGOs and civil society, often working on the front lines with those most hardest hit by the intersecting crises impacting our people and planet, the members of NGO CSocD have heard the calls for greater inclusion and social protections. How can we ensure this in this commission and future commissions, that those with the lived experience are able to substantively participate in CSocD processes? And how can the outcome resolution and action-oriented policy recommendations incorporate inputs from those with the lived experience of poverty, social exclusion, and lack of decent work opportunities? I thank you, Ambassador, for this time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jean, the Chair of the NGO Committee on Social Development. Dear colleagues, I don't see any further requests for the floor. In this, I would like now to give the floor to the Director of the International Labour Organization Office to respond to the questions and comments. Please, Ms. Andros, you have the floor.
Thank you again, Ambassador. I mean, some of the questions I think were directed to the Secretariat. I would perhaps pass on those, but just take questions that are relevant to the mandate of the ILO. One question was related to the link between business and human rights, the discussions that are going on in Geneva and the role with that commission. I mean, from our perspective, the international labor standards are part of the human rights body and have also been incorporated in the existing guiding principles on business and human rights. So we see obviously a very close link. I've made this connection in my earlier presentation, emphasizing the importance of rights, and also want to stress again that occupational safety and health is now part of that body of fundamental principles on right at work. I think that was clearly a lesson learned also from the pandemic. We would, from an ILO perspective, we would of course welcome a strong focus on youth and women. Again, I've mentioned the impact of the recent crises on youth employment, or I should say unemployment, as well as on women's participation in the labor force. So specific strategies and policies that would empower youth and women and also have their voices heard in the discussions would of course be very welcome from our perspective. And again, of course, as an organization that provides a lot of statistics, produces a lot of statistics on SDG Goal 8, on decent work and economic growth, of course, we stand ready to support the deliberations of member states in that commission, but also moving towards the high-level political forum in July, as well as the SDG summit. So please do count on us. Don't hesitate to reach out to our office here in New York. If you have further questions, we are more than happy to provide that information to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Andros. Very, very important response. I would like now to ask DESA to respond to some of the questions posed as well. So, Ms. Young, you have the floor.
Thank you. Let me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for organizing this this meeting, and thank our colleague from ILO for the presentation, and of course thank comments from EU delegation and from the NGO committee chair. They are all very important and relevant. Let me just try to address, as the EU delegates said, that this meeting is not specifically about some of the process and things, but nonetheless, let me try to answer, to provide some information, I hope, that will be useful to the EU delegation. And I'm more than happy to also meet, after this meeting to talk about things. With regard to youth participation, as you know that there is a youth delegate program that DESA supports. My colleagues who are working closely with youth delegation and youth organizations, they can provide more information, the concrete specific things that's involved in youth participation. I just want to let delegation know that there is a youth delegate program for youth engagement that after the meeting we can provide more information. With regard to outcome of the commission, and it's linked to the high-level political forum and the SDG summits that will be held in 2023. First of all, the outcome is, during the commission is deliberated and negotiated by member states. So the outcome, with the intention that the outcome of the commission would contribute to the July high-level political forum. And as you can see from the priority theme that the Bureau of the Commission had chosen, is also closely linked to the theme of the 2023 high-level political forum. So there's definitely a, if I may say, direct, substantive and technical connection to the HLPF. And related to the SDG summit, I don't mean to preempt what delegations and member states will come up with in the outcome document. I would venture to say that this, contribution to or connecting to the SDG summit will be on the minds of member states and delegations, right? When they deliberate and negotiate the outcome. So I think that the European delegation, certainly as representing member states, you also have a very important role to play in making this connection as clear, as direct as possible. And I think it just in terms of the process, the Commission's output will contribute to the HLPF. And I would think that the preparation for the SG summit being a UN system-wide effort and all member states involved in the SDG summit, I would think that the Commission will be making contributions to that process as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Yang, for this contribution. Dear colleagues, let me again thank the Director of ILO Office for her engagement and presentation. I'm sure this session was very beneficial for all of us in terms of getting the right background regarding to the main theme of the 61st session of the Commission taking place next in February. I thank the participants from the representative of the European Union and the chair of the the NGO Committee on Social Development. I think they brought about some key points on the importance of keeping in mind the upcoming important processes that are very relevant to the work of CSocD, and of course, evidently, the SDG Summit, and of course, as well, the Social Summit in 2025. I think these are all key, these are milestones in terms of the relevance to the work of the Commission, which I'm sure we will all work together to keep in mind as we navigate the work of the Commission next. I want to thank all of you for your participation. I think we had over 100 participants today at our virtual meeting, a great indication of the strong interest in the work of the Commission. And I would like to inform you all before I conclude the meeting that I intend to hold an informal briefing on the organizational arrangements of the 61st session of the Commission on Friday, January 13th at 10 a.m. and it will take place as well in a virtual format. The detail of the briefing will be shared through the e-delegate in due course. In this, dear colleagues, the informal intersessional preparatory meeting is concluded. Thank you very much.